morning, everyone, and welcome to this panel discussion taking place as part of this year's annual conference of COGEN Europe. The panel discussion, which is titled Fit for 55, Delivering for the People, the Planet, and the Economy. My name is Frédéric. I'm the Energy and Environment Editor of Euractiv.com. We're an online media specialized in EU affairs, and I will be your host for today's event. This year's COGEN annual conference is taking place just a few months now after the European Commission presented its landmark Fit for 55 package of climate and energy legislation, and just weeks now before it presents another package, this time on gas decarbonisation. So how can Fit for 55 deliver for the people, the planet, and the economy, and what can be the role of co-generation in that context? To discuss this topic today, I have the pleasure of welcoming here live in the office Dimitri Vergne from BEUC, the European Consumer Organization, Alix Bolle from Energy Cities, the European Association of Local Authorities in the Energy Transition, Guido, Lena, Director at SMEunited, representing small businesses, Jori, Ringman, Director General at CEPI, the Confederation of European Paper Industries, and Keramidas, Regulatory Affairs Director at Mytilineos, the Greek industrial and energy company, which is also a member of COGEN Europe. Welcome to all of you, and thanks for joining us live in person here in the office. We'll start this conference with a series of short opening statements from our panelists, and then we'll move on to a Q&A discussion that will also include questions from the audience, which is joining online. To put a question, please use the chat function on Zoom, and we will take questions from it. I think that's all for me when it comes to the introductions, but before we dive into the discussion, let's start by watching a short video introduction that COGEN Europe has prepared for us. The video includes statements from three influential MPs, Sean Kelly, Marcus Weber, and Niels Borzan.
Hello. I would like to thank COGEN Europe for organising a very timely and important event. As everybody knows, we now have Fit for 55 and the Green Deal in Europe, which sets the legislative framework for decarbonising our economy. Buildings are going to have a huge role in that, as they are responsible for 36% of greenhouse gas emissions and 40% of energy consumption. Obviously, retrofitting is going to be a huge part of it, but emphasis also has to be put especially on heating and cooling. And I think a district-based approach and cogeneration for large-scale renovations in conjunction with stakeholders has a huge role to play in how we decarbonise our working and living spaces. I want to see immediate progress in this area, and I think that's something that COGEN Europe are now outlining, which is very important. Thank you very much.
Dear participants of this year's COGEN Europe conference, the debate about rising energy prices underlines how valuable energy is. I therefore expressly welcome COGEN's efforts in pointing out that we can no longer afford to waste energy. In my role as a rapporteur for the review of the Renewable Energy Directive within the Fit for 55 package, I am interested in the input of stakeholders such as COGEN, because there's one important aspect missing from the Commission's proposal: the push for innovation, for every single consumer as well as for the industry. The RED III is a great opportunity to think outside the box in this sense, especially so that the entire Fit for 55 package can become a success story for our citizens and companies. It is not enough to simply set the targets high. We also have to develop measures how those higher targets can be affordable. For this purpose, you have always been delivering valuable inputs. I wish you all an exciting and successful exchange today and look forward to learning about the results. Enjoy. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Niels Fuglsang. I'm a member of the European Parliament. I represent the Socialists and Democrats, and I'm elected from Denmark. I have a seat in the Energy and Industry and Research Committee, the ITRE Committee it's called, and here I deal with the energy policy. We are about to start negotiations on the so-called Fit for 55 package, which is a number of legal proposals, legislative proposals on how to mitigate climate change. Obviously, energy is very important when it comes to this effort, and I myself have gotten the position as rapporteur, lead negotiator on the Energy Efficiency Directive. I think we often talk about renewable energy, which we should, which is paramount if we are to mitigate climate change. But we should also talk about, and perhaps more about than we do right now, energy efficiency, how we can make our energy system more efficient so that we use less energy. One of the ways to do that is to have better isolations in buildings, such as the one I'm sitting in right now, the European Parliament. Many other buildings that lose the heat very fast because they're not very well insulated. So we need to renovate a lot of buildings to make sure that we spend less energy. Another thing that I think we should also do, which is from my own country, we have used these solutions very much, which is cogeneration of heat and power. So you have a power plant and you produce electricity in that power plant, but at the same time you have surplus heat is created, and we can use that heat instead of just wasting it. We can use it to actually heat up water and then use it in district heating systems, and that's a way to increase energy efficiency. There are lots of things we can do. I think the potential is huge, and we need to have a policy, and that's the purpose of the policy that I'm negotiating, a policy that actually makes requirements of the member states, of the businesses, to increase the energy efficiency. So let's get on with it. I look forward to the debate with all of you.
Well, the introduction and encouragement. I guess we can now get started immediately with the introduction statement. Let me give the floor straight away to Dimitri from BEUC. Dimitri.
Thank you, Frédéric, and thanks to COGEN for having us on the panel. What I would say is that as consumer groups, we really see the energy transition as a key chance for consumers to improve their quality of life, bring some financial benefits while contributing to the fight against the climate crisis. And if designed the right way, we really insist that the climate transition and the energy transition are a chance for European consumers. And I think this is a very important message to stress at the current moment with the rising energy prices. We need really to defend the narrative that it's the energy transition moving away from fossil fuels, which will shield consumers against rising prices. And right now we're in the middle of the discussion, or the start of the discussion rather, on the Fit for 55 package, and now the gas package, which is coming, and the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. These are all good proposals that we need to work on to achieve those objectives. And maybe I would insist on 3 points which are important for consumers to bear in mind in this transition. First, it's very important that we prioritize those technologies which bring maximum benefit to consumers. And for heating and cooling, this is clearly electricity and district heating. This is important because we're making strong choices at the moment, and we cannot allow ourselves to invest in the wrong technologies and lock in consumers in expensive and carbon-emitting heating and cooling solutions. The second aspect, and MEP Fuglsang insisted on it, is the insistence on energy efficiency. This is, of course, a key point for us. Housing renovation is a no-brainer, but it's not an easy task. And there I would say it's important to put money in this. Of course, money is of essence, but there are many other things that need to happen. For instance, through the Energy Efficiency Directive, to lift the practical barriers for consumers in their renovation efforts. Be it the absence of trustworthy installers, the creation of new financial instruments beyond subsidies, concrete support throughout the renovation journey. These are all things that we need to work on to make this renovation wave a reality. And the last point I'd like to make, which is of course a key battle for consumer groups, is the protection of consumer rights in energy markets. We have good consumer rights in electricity market. We need to mirror those rights in district heating and gas markets. To make sure that consumers feel secure, safe when going on this market. And the gas package, the EED, are key opportunities to do just that.
Thanks very much, Dimitri, for this good introduction. Let me give the floor now straight away to the next speaker, and that is Alix Bolle from Energy City.
Thank you, Frédéric, and thank you, COGEN Europe, for having me. And I'm glad to be representing the city's voice today and bring a bit of gender balance in this panel as well. So from our very perspective, I think we, as energy cities, welcome the Fit for 55 package in general. I think there are some good orientations in this package in terms of the increased recognition of local actors, local communities, local authorities, I think are prominent in the package. In the revised legislations on renewable energy, on energy efficiency, we have seen some good provisions in there, including a provision on the EED, which requires member states to have their cities conduct heat planning with associated capacity building, and to the utmost extent possible, which is very important for us, financial support, capacity building support for cities to be able to actually deliver that. We see some push also for locally anchored projects in the package. So for shared ownership, shared benefits, shared control over local projects through an additional boost that has been given to local energy communities. So which was already in the clean energy package, and there's a continuation of that in the Fit for 55, which we welcome. But two caveats, nonetheless, in terms of the scope of the package. What we regret is that local actors are often considered downstream in the process as implementers, whereas it would be good to actually embark kind of the local context and local actors in the kind of grand scheme of things when designing the big scenarios and assumptions. At the national level, we need to take account of the local potential, of which cogeneration and district heating and cooling is obviously an example. So this is one thing that we regret, and I mentioned this obligation for heat planning. We haven't seen so much language on how this is going to interact with the NECP process of National Energy and Climate Plans. So this is, so we also regret that this new planning requirement is not mirrored also in the Renewable Energy Directive. So we're seeing a bit of, again, a kind of sector-based focus. It's good that we're finally looking at heat, but we should have an integrated approach altogether for cities to plan their energy transition, also in the Renewable Energy Directive. The second caveat is that we have potentially the political direction, but we need the toolbox. As you mentioned, we need the support. Cities have a huge lack of human capital to actually deliver the transition. So we see also that in terms of what has been proposed, we might agree or not with the ETS2, but the social climate fund that has been proposed to mitigate its effects is again based on a very top-down kind of methodology, governance framework, as was the resilience and recovery plans, with member states top-down submitting plans and the Commission putting a stamp on it. There, if we're looking at social aspects, especially, we need to have a more of a kind of bottom-up process, more with a territorial governance logic, such as the Cohesion Fund or the Just Transition Fund. So this is a very important element for us as well. And then to finish, maybe coming back on the title of this session, so it's the Fit for 55, delivering for the people, the planet and the economy. I'm wondering if we couldn't put this the other way around and say that the economy should actually deliver for the people and the planet, hence the Fit for 55. When preparing this session, I came across a report co-authored by the Transnational Institute with the very eloquent title of energy transition or energy expansion. I think we might be going in the second direction. And so no matter how much carrots and sticks we put to phase out fossil fuels and phasing renewables, I think at the EU level too, in terms of the lawmaking arsenal, we also need to look at how we move also the kind of economic system that's based on consumerism, which we're based on. And it's not an ideological stance to say that, it's also a finding of the IPCC report. And cities are doing that. They are reviewing their economic model at the same time that they're designing their energy transition. So one gap from this package, I think, is also to review the EU economic rules in a way that we can make the most of the local resources without creating planetary and social imbalances.
Thanks, Alix. And you've already anticipated on the first question that I will put to the panel after we're done with the first round, which is indeed to look at the balance between these three objectives, which is people, planet, and the economy. And it's on now to Guido, Lena, for your introductory statement.
Yes, thank you, and good morning. So I would say that this package will definitely impact a lot of SMEs, because SMEs you can find them in all areas of our society. Since we represent SME in general and not a particular sector, we are still trying to, with our members, to evaluate this huge package and its impact. But it's already clear that at least the SMEs, which are the enablers, will profit from it. So the one working in construction, the one repairing, maintenance, giving maintenance to equipment, to new technologies, while the other ones, particularly the industrial SMEs, will probably suffer quite an increase of cost and red tape. I mean, for us, the key issue is, okay, it's good, and we must move from fossil fuels to renewable, but in the end, the process should result in a situation where SMEs can benefit or can have all the renewable energy they need whenever they need at affordable cost, if we want to keep our life standards and employment and growth in Europe. So for this, I think we need some framework conditions. We need more production of renewable energy in Europe. We need to find, if we don't produce it here, we need to find it somewhere else in the neighboring countries, and so foster the energy diplomacy of the EU. We need to foster and strengthen interconnections among member states, but also from neighboring countries and the EU. We need to strengthen the distribution, transmission network, the storage possibilities we have. We also absolutely need systemic measures to foster less energy, so less use of energy and more energy efficiency. And definitely focusing on technology neutrality. We've seen that there's a lot of emphasis in the package on the electrification, but that also has some limit. We risk to be locked in with raw materials that we maybe don't have in Europe, with waste that it's difficult then to get rid of, with the fact that where do we find all these renewable electricity? So according to us, we should foster all the possible new technologies and renewable technologies and renewable energies. And we also need a lot of research, investment, and innovation. This is something that everybody says, because we have to develop some new technology which help us leapfrog to the end, because at the moment with the current technology, it's probably difficult to reach these new targets. And I take as example, a good idea that I heard from my Prime Minister in Italy, Mr. Draghi, and he said, well, in the COP26 conference, he said, well, as we manage through international cooperation to have all these vaccines for the pandemic very quickly, we should join forces also in renovation, in research and development and innovation, to have some new technologies that we can use worldwide to face this problem. Also because Europe alone is only responsible probably in 2030 from 8 to 10% of CO2 emissions. So if we only do it here, nothing will change. And this links with the last point is definitely we need international cooperation, to real international cooperation. And so the carbon diplomacy of the EU should be developed to so that the whole world really start doing something about it. Because otherwise, if we just do it ourselves, first, we are not going to achieve the aim. Secondly, our competitiveness can be put in danger. I think for the time being, these are our key points. Thank you.
Thanks, Guido. And let me give the floor now to Jori Ringman.
Thank you. And thank you, COGEN, for this opportunity to be in the panel this morning. We, as a sector, support the objectives of 2030 and 2050, of course. And we see that we can be a big enabler in getting those targets. Why? Simply because we actually not only are much advanced in our own decarbonization, but we also produce materials that enable consumers to choose the non-fossil alternatives in the market. And if we empower the consumers, then of course we can also face this emergency of climate change with much faster solutions, because when the consumers choose right today, it has an immediate and significant impact. Immediate. So that's why we believe that we can be offering this wider opportunities for society to meet these targets here and now. We actually talk about not only disruption but fire disruption. So we can offer something quite powerful to the society. Another important thing about our looking at this Fit for 55 package, or now the next wave of packages in this Green Deal, is that we didn't start today. We started already a long time ago in this journey, going towards bioeconomy and decarbonization. We already reached 29% decarbonization over 2005. 62% of our own energy is already renewable energy. So compared to many other industry sectors, this is quite unique. And of course, nearly 100% of that is COGEN. So we are also very energy efficient in using not only the biomass that we use in this generation is residues from our own production processes, but it's also highly efficiently used in cogeneration. And then, of course, when we do that, we can share also the excess power and excess heat with other industries, other consumers, or the local communities if they are nearby. So that's something that we have as a starting point. So we now want to see this Fit for 55 package, if it's supporting then the industry going further. So not starting from here, but going further and continuing with the investments already done. And that's important to understand why we are also slightly critical of that. The good thing I wanted to mention before going to why we see that this is as a lacking toolbox is that it really does now set almost in stone the objective. So I don't think there's any unclarity about where the EU wants to go and where the EU wants to move the economy in the 2030 and 2050. And that's of course important if we want to see investments happening. If there's unclarity of the direction, then of course the investments don't get us there. The first thing we see in why this is a lacking toolbox is that it seems to be still missing these opportunities in getting to this fire disruption, empowering the consumers, and seeing the opportunities in offering the decarbonized solutions, both in energy but also in consumption or materials and products. And why we see this as important is that if we don't keep the fossils in the ground, so they are now safely stored and captured in the ground, let's keep it that way instead of emitting them up to air and then paying expensive and insecure systems to try to capture and store them again. They are now captured and stored, let's keep them there. So we can do that by shifting the consumption to renewables. And if you don't do that, there's not enough forest to compensate or offset that. There's not even space enough for forest to do that in the whole world. And we don't also meet the 2030 and 2050 targets. So we need to stop emitting fossils. That's the first thing, and then that's not clearly there, I see in this package. Then this design of the toolbox, I see that it's too much still in this one size fits all. You mentioned the top down already. That's very much there as a saying that we micromanage from Brussels to do the things in one thing, and it's more stick than the carrot. So instead of that, I think it should have a design that accepts the complexity of the situation and the actions that are needed. And then in that, we see these many transitions that are needed in parallel. So the transition of the energy, the transition of the technology, the transition of the infrastructure. And in that, consumers, local communities, individual companies, we have 2/3 of our companies are SMEs. But even the multinationals are really lost in this. Saying that, well, what now? How can we navigate this transition? And then even individual sectors are a bit lost. So I think this help and support for navigation is missing there, and it's not easy. The third is that we hope that the European Parliament, the member states can then still address the elements that are not there, which is really supporting the made in Europe industry like us. We are very much sourced, manufactured, recycled in Europe with European technology and in big amount European energy. So if there's no support for that, then again the things won't happen. And then on the contrary, we wanted in this COVID crisis to even call more industries to come back to Europe. So this means that there has to be space for this production in Europe with access to affordable energy that is clean. And then this is not happening. It's not facilitating integration of the energy systems. So adding more to complexity, but we need to have this energy system integration and industrial symbiosis to happen. Because otherwise, again, we won't get things happening. But when the starting point to getting there, we need to really see the system thinking there and facilitating that. We can, as a sector, help others to decarbonize in many sectors, in mobility, in heating, in cooling. But if there's no sector integration, it doesn't. And then last thing is that we hope that the Parliament and Council can help in aligning better these many proposals in the Fit for 55 package, but also across the many packages that are in the Green Deal. And then that's easier said than done, but if it's not done, also catastrophe is looming because the devil is in the street.
Thanks, Jori, Ringman. And so let me turn now to Nick Keramidas, Mytilineos, for the final opening statement.
Thank you very much, Frédéric. Thank you, COGEN, for this opportunity as well. Let me start by just saying, first of all, that the Commission's intentions with the Fit for 55 package are definitely commendable. And this is kind of something that comes from COGEN Europe and Mytilineos as well. Right? We've, as COGEN Europe, we carried out a report outlining how it's going to play out until 2050. And quite frankly, we fully support the target for climate neutrality by 2050. Also at Mytilineos, back in February 2021, we laid out very, very thorough analysis of the goals, the specific goals, thoroughly assessed goals to reach climate neutrality by 2050 and achieve massive drastic reductions in emissions by 2030. What we also need to do, though, is make sure that this map that's guiding us there is genuinely achievable. And MEP Pieper alluded to it earlier a bit. So sustainability and growth can definitely go hand in hand. There's no denying that. But the recipe is kind of tricky. And it requires a broader set of tools. And it actually might even require a broader set of goals. So emission cuts in Europe alone is the means to an end. And I'm bringing in a more global approach right now into this discussion. In pushing for emission cuts really aggressively in Europe, we have actually achieved or contributed to an increase in global emissions. This is unfortunately a reality that we need to address when designing policy going forward. This is in some sectors, at least, like our sector, aluminum production, we've actually ended up encouraging investment leakage, which led to carbon leakage and also exacerbated the Europe's import dependence, which is a huge problem that we also faced during the COVID, and Jori also alluded to it earlier. I'm going to come back to that later if we have some time to go into the industry specifics. Now, looking at this specifically within Europe and as far as the solutions proposed are concerned, first of all, let me say that, for instance, the Renewables Energy Directive, also mentioned by MEP Pieper earlier, is a fine example of going about it the right way. So there are incentives described in there, not very specifically, but we'll get to that, about corporate PPAs, and this is also encouraging. And we want to see more of that. we definitely believe that this is going to help in the right direction. However, what we're not seeing is a push, a promotion of technologies readily available, which deliver significant primary and final energy savings, and also actually contribute massively to drastic emission cuts. Lock-in was mentioned earlier by Dimitri, and this is right to be mentioned, but the fear of locking in gas might actually end up locking in lignite in Greece, for instance. And we don't want to see that happen. We definitely have to prevent that from happening. So there is a lot of coal and lignite going about in Europe, energy production, or even district heating, which needs to be replaced by readily available and drastically reducing emissions technologies, which are really, really resource efficient right now. So the reason behind this is simple. We're constantly in the Brussels bubble adopting this black and white approach, right? So this may be okay for campaigning and stuff, but when it comes to achieving the goals, when it comes to real life, real production, real jobs, it's quite trickier than that. It's way more difficult. Now, high efficiency cogeneration is really a fine example of an enabling technology to get to where we want to go. It's actually the most energy efficient producing technology currently out there. And this is definitely not being properly recognized. I'm going to give a couple of examples, just indicative examples. For instance, when we go to the future energy savings obligation schemes, high efficiency CHP from gas is excluded. Why? Well, because apparently, gas is bad, so we don't want gas and so on and so forth. But the truth is, we're comparing high efficiency CHP to heat only or power only production. And we're foregoing massive energy savings doing that. And at the same time, for instance, a heat pump fired by, let's say, electricity coming from a coal grid or coal-based grid is definitely considered eligible. I don't have anything against heat pumps, don't get me wrong, but it's just something that needs to be flagged. It's an inconsistency. The same goes for efficient district heating and cooling systems from 2035 onwards, where a high efficiency CHP is no longer a criterion for efficient district heating and cooling. The reason, again, is that CHP in the mind of policymakers is tantamount to gas. Actually, CHP is fuel agnostic. We can burn anything you give us the most efficient way. If you give us renewable gases, if you give us hydrogen, we're going to burn it the best way possible to deliver the needed amounts of heat and power. And this is the way to go. We cannot afford to forego this. The same applies for the Energy Taxation Directive proposal by the Commission. There, for instance, we have the exemption going on for energy products used for, let's say, electricity production alone. These are absolutely exempted. It's not the same for energy products used in high efficiency cogeneration. These are partially exempt and optional tax exemptions are foreseen. This makes absolutely no sense. Now, focusing again on CHP, looking forward towards the grid situation of the future, we're going to be relying more and more on intermittent renewables. And Jori alluded to it earlier. What we need is flexibility. And CHP can provide this flexibility in the most low carbon and efficient way possible. So this is essential for industry. This is essential for buildings. This is essential for cities, definitely. This is essential for everybody, for all the solutions out there required. Now, electrification was alluded to it earlier. I can speak for the aluminum industry. We're fully electrified, right? But unfortunately, electrification alone is not equal to full decarbonization. We see that. We see that in the taxonomy, wherein we are asked, being the most electro-intensive sector out there right now and the most sensitive in terms of pricing, to go entirely green, 100% RES more or less. So the same should apply for everything. We must make sure that we ramp up RES share in the grids, and this trajectory follows electrification, because otherwise we'll end up electrifying everything without the necessary RES amount in the system. So we'll actually electrify and rely on either coal or gas in the future. That makes no sense. And we're constantly looking at tailpipe emissions in Europe in order to just save the argument, but that's not the way to do it. EVs, heat pumps. I mentioned some examples earlier. Now, for us, what we need to be aiming for is a cost-effective decarbonization, which ensures good performance of the entire energy system, integrated energy system, as Jori mentioned earlier. So there are three asks, basically. There's security of supply, affordable prices, and environmental sustainability. And this is what CHP is all about. And it's definitely part of the solution, not the problem. I hope I get the chance later on to discuss a little bit about specific challenges with the aluminum sector and alumina as well, to elaborate on that. Thanks.
Thanks, Nick. And yes, indeed, there will be opportunities to develop there on the issue of affordability a little bit later on. Let me get started now the Q&A session with a general question, sticking with the title of this conference, which I will ask each one of you to answer from your own perspective. So the title of this session is Delivering for the People, the Planet and the Economy. Now we have this Fit for 55 package, which is on the table since July. Dimitri, maybe you can start. Would you say the package actually strikes the right balance between people, planet, and the economy, or do you see some missing elements or maybe some imbalances?
Well, as consumer groups, we really strongly welcome the package. Of course, we're all working on recommendations and improving it, strengthening some provisions, and that's our job. But we really think the package is a very good starting basis to do what we need to do, which is structural changes, framework conditions. You know, what we aim at as consumer groups is to make sure that the alternatives to unsustainable lifestyle are first available, then affordable, and then convenient and attractive. And that's really the guiding principle we're following when working on all these legislative pieces. And maybe let me just pick up on one point on technology, because it has been mentioned many times, electrification versus other technology. Well, Nick mentioned they did some thorough analysis, so did we. And from a very pragmatic consumer point of view, you know, we looked into, for instance, total cost of ownership of electric cars versus other powertrains. And we see that for individual mobility, electric cars is the way forward. It's the technology which brings you the biggest benefits, both in terms of in financial terms and in climate and environmental terms. And allow me a teaser, maybe. We're conducting same kind of study now on heating appliances that we will release by the end of the month, looking at heat pumps versus, for instance, hydrogen boilers. And there, same thing, direct electrification is the best way forward. It does not mean that hydrogen has no role. For your industry, for instance, it will be very important, I guess, Nick, in aluminium for very carbon-intensive industries. But for individual consumers, individual households, electrification is really the way forward.
Okay, thanks, Dimitri. Let me take the opportunity to remind the online audience that you can put questions directly to the panelists using the chat function on Zoom. We can pick up some of the questions from there later on. Let me turn now to Alix with the same question. Would you say the Fit for 55 strikes the right balance between all these two objectives, people, planet, and the economy? Or do you believe this package will allow cities to play the full part as part of that picture?
I think it's, as I mentioned, I think it's a good beginning, but I don't think we have the adequate balance. I think there is some additional work that needs to be put into that. In terms of the people, I think the ETS, the proposition to extend carbon pricing on buildings and transport is worrying in terms of the impact that it might have on vulnerable consumers. So if the mitigation, the proposed mitigation, as I mentioned earlier, is to create a top-down fund with only member states putting forward proposals, I'm afraid we might be missing on some good proposals coming from cities, because cities are actually delivering on putting together local projects with neighborhood kind of approach, embarking all their stakeholders in the process, and really trying to create local added value. Which is why I mentioned, like, for me, delivering on the economy is creating new types of economic models that are based on relocalizing the economy as well. So we can have local food, but we can have local energy as well, based on shorter supply chains. And I think this is really a very important element, which is not enough, which is not part of this package to the extent that we would wish. And mentioning the planet, what Jori mentioned about keeping the fossil in the ground instead of doing CCS makes me think of an article, a quote that I saw in an FT article, which said that it's like, you know, your doctor, if you're drinking too much alcohol, telling you that the government will put together liver repair technologies later on. So I think really it's a question of, you know, starting from the right basis of not creating the problem in the first place. So we completely agree to that. And I would like to indeed that we have more kind of perhaps direction in the package in terms of investment security and giving the right orientations for cities to know what kind of policies they can put forward locally. We issued a survey to our members on the package. And for example, on the question of phasing out individual gas boilers, we had a majority for both existing and new buildings, something that's been proposed in the UK, which would help cities having that clear direction to then enact other types of policies at local level and have the associated enabling framework for that.
Thanks, Vergne. Guido and Lena, same question to you. Should the Fit for 55 strikes the right balance from the point of view of SMEs when it comes to the economy, the planet?
Well, it's a very challenging question. It's not easy to answer. I would say that well, if you see the whole package from the point of view of SMEs, let's put in the economy. Most of our economy is based on SMEs. So I will more or less, although it's not 100% fair, I will identify economy and SMEs in this case. But SMEs are very rarely in the package subject to direct measure, favorable measures. So very often it's more indirect measures that favor SMEs. But the whole package is not seen from, wasn't created keeping in the think small first principle in mind. So what we really miss here is some key efforts to try to allow SMEs to go through this green transition. First of all, most of the impact assessment which are in the package are not good enough, are not deep enough. You understand that they were made very quickly. So there is no real impact assessment telling you what the impact of SMEs on most of these measures is, which is already quite negative, because if they have to implement it and nobody knows, it's a little bit questionable. Secondly, there's also very little effort to reduce one of the key obstacles for SMEs, which is bureaucracy, red tape. Nowhere this is mentioned. For example, also in the CBAM, when you import, only these registered declarant can do these and with very complicated rules. So it is definitely not suitable for SMEs. And then what you need is a whole package of initiatives, like definitely focus on more information, particularly for the traditional SMEs. We have to consider that most of our SMEs are still in the process of changing, or would like to change, or are thinking of changing, but they are not the gazelle, they are not the front runners. So you have to guarantee that these companies survive the green transition, otherwise we lose employment and growth. So you need more information, you definitely need more technical assistance, particularly at the local level. So you have to work with the member states. You need easier access to finance. It costs a lot to change your plans, your products. You need upskilling and reskilling of workers to green and also digital technologies. You also need, some fiscal incentives at national level to move a little bit forward. You need also, in my opinion, to rely more on SME organization to cooperate and try to reach out to their members and spread the news. All these is not inside the package. Okay, somebody might say, okay, it's in the SME strategy partly, but it's difficult to see how these pieces glue together to create a coherent framework. We also have to see that some of this legislation was recently reviewed. So if you keep changing the target and modifying this target and increasing them every time you ask for new investment, it's obvious. And this doesn't respect also the investment cycle of companies, and they can also create a lot of uncertainty, because if I don't know whether in 5 years this target change again and I'm required to invest again, I maybe refrain from investing, which delays the whole process. So yeah, and then I fully agree with my colleague as far as the extension of ETS is concerned. I think that this process, as it's presented now, is definitely not transparent. It's definitely not easy to manage, and because basically, if you are a micro company which spend more for fuels or heating, then you should be reimbursed or compensated partially. It's not clear how much, from a member state using a European fund. So it's definitely very complicated. Why you need for these hands-on, very easy procedures. And if you see now the uproar that the increase of energy prices are created in all Europe, if people start linking increase of cost with the EU Commission and with the climate change, you might start fueling these anti-EU feelings, which are already quite widespread in some member states, and also maybe opposition to climate change, because you can be in favor of all the climate change, fight of the climate change as much as you want, but when you start touching your own money and it's difficult to get to the end of the month, you might change your mind. So you have to be very prudent with this thing.
Absolutely. Thank you, Guido, Lena, for bringing us maybe a little bit more back to earth, or at least with the realities of how SMEs, which are the lifeblood of our society, as we often say, or at least our economy, the concrete difficulties they might be facing. Let me turn to Jori Ringman now for your own views about the overall balance of the 55 package between these three things that we identified for today's session, which is the economy, the planet, and the people. Do you see a good balance overall in this package, or do you see some missing pieces or imbalances there?
Well, you would expect a good balance, because the whole idea of the EU actually is to harness the business in front of the noble cause. So 7 years ago, the idea was that let's align the business interest with what we need, which is peace and stability in the continent. And that worked. It worked wonderfully, actually. And that would still work. So when you mentioned earlier that business should work for the people and planet, that can happen, and that's the idea. And an ideal set that is aligned so well. And then that would be really much in the heart of the EU. We are now sitting only a few hundred meters away from the headquarters of the EU. So I regret that it's not happening. But to challenge you a bit is that when we have EU legislation, it has to serve all these things. So with the legislation in place, then business can serve the planet and the people. But the legislation, we can legitimately ask that it serves all three. So there I want to have a slight modification to your statement. And then importantly, of course, we need to have for business the stability and predictability. And then protection for the industry here in global competition, where we otherwise just start importing again things with the rucksack of nasty environmental impacts all over the planet. Or then for the investments that has been happening and are going to happen, are needed for this transition. So this is what this is lacking for the business side here. And then there the balance is not quite there. Otherwise, I would say that the sort of for this balance, what I see is that there's not really this gear change for the sustainability. So for the society's consumption and then the industry supplying for that consumption. I don't see that still clearly in that, and that balance is also missing. And on the contrary, maybe I'm too biased here, but I see some elements in the architecture of this whole Green Deal and in fact the Fit for 55 package that is still protecting very much the interest of the old fossil economy. So that's I think where the balance is still also lacking. Then thinking about the people perspective and business perspective, we already mentioned it briefly that this policy design is still very much built on this idea of believing in this command from Brussels and one size fits all, and hoping that there's a silver bullet. And then I don't think that's realistic. And then I like the idea of building it from the bottom or trusting the local communities. And of course, business is part of the local community, very important part of the local community. So again, the balance is almost intrinsically built into this if we want to have that approach. And then the third missing element is there that was already mentioned by Guido as well, is that the key open question is that, well, do we have and where do we have the access for affordable clean energy? Because many of the companies, they are not energy producers. They need energy, but they are not specialists in energy. They are not producing energy. And we are throwing this challenge to business to say that, well, find your way, without answering the question of where can I find the energy that is clean, decarbonized, and affordable, accessible, and then long-term availability. If that's not happening, then I don't think we find the balance. And then it's of course equally important that was mentioned by BEUC as well. That's the same question that consumers have. In that we are all sitting in the same boat.
Thanks, Jori, Ringman. So let me turn now to Keramidas. Your thoughts about the balance overall in this 55 package between these three key objectives, which is economy, planet, and people.
Well, planet is really important in this regard. And I think that when you look at whether or not it strikes a balance as far as the planet is concerned in terms of climate change, fighting climate change efficiently, I think we're not going about it, particularly for certain sectors, the right way. So we got European production in some sectors having by far the lowest carbon footprint worldwide. And we're still seeing shutdowns, curtailments in Europe, and no new investment happening in Europe. We're seeing investment happen elsewhere. Why? Because we do know that for products like paper, for products like aluminium, there will be massive need. There's growing demand. And this demand, unfortunately, is constantly being met by production elsewhere, which is far more carbon intensive. So if we're doing that, looking at European emissions alone and cutting European emissions alone, unfortunately, at least for some sectors, we need to reassess. Let me put it this way. Now, let me start by saying, I mean, the Commission's proposal, for instance, on the ETS, that entails a triple squeeze of the price, right? We have the MSR restructuring, we have the linear reduction factor going steeper, and we also have rebasing. That's jargon, but you know, for the Brussels people, that's probably all understandable. So this will mean skyrocketing ETS prices in the future, coupled with a massive reduction of free allowances, which is going to be exacerbated for the CBAM sectors, by the way. And unfortunately, for quite a lot of sectors, the alternatives are not readily available. And this was mentioned by Dimitri earlier as well, and Alix, I think, as well. If we don't have alternatives that are there and cost-effective and attractive, I think that was the word that was used, and I fully agree with that, then we're not going to manage. Focus was made earlier by Guido as well on how the ETS extension to buildings and transport is going to maybe compromise, let's say, the engagement of people. Well, I want to say that the same definitely applies for industry. And industry, in some sectors at least, like aluminium, we're a price taker industry. That means we cannot pass on additional costs to consumers. So if through ETS prices, our production cost rises by 30, 40, 50%, we are out of business. And trust me, in the meantime, we've seen China, where aluminum smelters are popping up like mushrooms, and they have 3 times the carbon intensity of European aluminium smelters. So from a Fit for 55 perspective, stricto sensu, in Europe, adding 1 ton of aluminium in Europe means adding 5-6 tons of CO2 in the European emissions. And that's really bad. From a global perspective, adding 1 ton of aluminium production in Europe, displacing Chinese production, means a net impact of minus 12 tons of CO2 for global emissions. And that's what matters. So instead of mitigating or trying to mitigate or trying to stop maybe carbon leakage, we need to actually reverse it. And this will have a very, very important, significant role to play in our growth and the engagement of society, because this is when it will become visible for all people that this is genuinely a growth strategy. And by the way, this is going to show, if we make sure that we are competitive in green production in Europe, sustainable production, this is going to be way more efficient in convincing others as well, and avoid what's referred to often as the fragmented scenario. If you look at the impact assessment of the Commission, that's how they call it. Fragmented scenario is what happened in Glasgow. It's where Europe goes at it alone and the others not following. And fragmented scenario means quite a lot of unemployment, unfortunately, and not growth. So we need to make sure that we avoid this while producing the optimal result for the environment as well. And this will also positively impact what we commonly refer to in Brussels as strategic autonomy for Europe. Strategic autonomy is a really weird notion for not importing anything, or, well, everything at least, to put it mildly. And quite frankly, what we've been doing over the past 30 years is importing emissions. Europe has succeeded over the past 30 years in reducing its overall emissions by 20%. The industry has reduced its emissions by 30%. And in the meantime, 1990 to 2020, global emissions have risen by 60%. This is unacceptable from a climate perspective. This means that we need to go about it in a different way, at least as far as globally exposed sectors are concerned. That's it for now.
Thanks, Nick, Keramidas. We've got just about 15 minutes left, so I still have a couple of questions for you, so I'll ask you to be maybe a bit shorter this time. Let's focus for a moment on the issue of affordability, and I will start with you, Dimitri. We've seen over the past weeks with the energy crunch that affordability of energy is absolutely essential. And yet, the transition to climate neutrality implies massive investments into new technologies, into renewables that will cost hundreds of billions of euros per year. So, Dimitri, how can such a transition be affordable from the point of view of consumers? What do you think are the main ingredients that would make this transition less costly for consumers? And do you think there is a place there for technologies like gas or cogeneration?
Well, of course, affordability is key. I can't comment on the industry, but we face a bit the same challenge as individual consumers. The upfront costs of a new electric car, a heat pump, are higher than the fossil-based equivalent. And so this is something that we need to look at. However, again, if you look at this total cost of ownership, so a longer period of time, we see it brings benefits. It doesn't solve the situation for someone who just cannot afford a heat pump or an electric car, but so we need to have this long-term perspective. And so this is the role of public authorities, governments, to help people make the switch through incentives to switch to electric cars, for instance, second-hand electric cars as well, so that you touch a larger part of the population, or incentives to switch to heat pumps. For instance, in Italy, you have very strong purchase subsidies, and this works. This really and this is a smart investment. Then I'd say a good manner to maybe avoid. We know there will be massive investments needed, and it's clear for everyone. But what we're saying is that we need to avoid the wrong technology choices, which would make it costly for everyone. And again, here I want to insist on this gas versus electricity debate in the for individual heating. There we know that going for hydrogen, for instance, for individual heating doesn't work. It will require massive investment, and it will be much more expensive for individual consumers. So let's avoid, this investing in this in this technology for individual heating. Avoiding costs is also about avoiding wrong investment. And final point on ETS, because that was mentioned, ETS extension to road transport and buildings, where as consumer groups who were quite skeptical about this, to say the least, before the package was published. And we said that we saw this as a high risk, low reward strategy. That being said, now it's on the table, so we'll see where it goes. There is also this social climate fund, which I think is a sign that the Commission has understood this social aspect. We need to make it work so that really all the revenues of this ETS2 flow back to those in need, meaning consumers, low-income consumers, and very much interested in Alix's proposal as how to improve the governance of the system so that it's more bottom-up and better targeted. So on that, would probably appreciate the follow-up discussion.
Thanks, Dimitri. Alix, turning to you now. How can this transition be made more affordable for the cities? Because we know the cities is where climate change is happening. You're making a lot of investments yourself. How can these investments be made affordable?
If you allow me, I would like to just quickly pick up on the challenge that was given to me by Jori. I just want to highlight that I don't mean by saying that the economy should deliver for the people and the planet. I'm not saying that we should not take into account economic powerhouses and yes, like SMEs that are delivering jobs for people, and we should take the economic actors in mind. But I'm just saying that we need to look into economic models that take into account planetary boundaries. And so I think this is not necessarily the direction the package has taken for the moment. In terms of your question on affordability, I think it's important to help the cities plan the transition as efficiently as possible to have the most cost-efficient solutions, readily available solutions, as you mentioned. I came across reports. We have a member. We're having our annual conference in Halle in the Netherlands. It's a city which is using underground mine water to power its fifth generation district heating network in a very, very efficient way. So this is an energy that's under the feet of people. I read that in the UK, apparently 1/4 of households might be sitting above mine water. So there's really like efficiency gains, local solutions that can be tapped, but that are not going, that are not being reported for in the big, as I said, in the big schemes of things, in the big scenarios that are being established at the national level. So I think helping the cities plan the transition adequately is something that's very, very important. I just want to give the example of cities in the Netherlands already have this requirement to conduct heat planning. It's something that's for cities of all sizes, but they do not get the support to do it from the government. According to a study on the implementation of the Dutch Climate Agreement for local governments, between 2022 and 2030, the heat transition in buildings will require in 2024 up to 65 full-time equivalent employees in the biggest cities and 4 in the smallest one. So this tells you the amount of the challenge in terms of the human capital that's needed to plan this transition and actually find all the low-hanging fruits that can be tapped here and there in terms of residual heat, etc. So I think there's really a huge need there to put forward this requirement for local energy planning and have the associated toolbox for that.
Thanks, Alix. Lena, very quickly about affordability from the point of view of SMEs, what could really help there?
Well, I think, I will say something that already my colleagues before said. First of all, I have the feeling that you have to invest on the right alternative technology of fostering the plethora of the right renewable energy. For example, there are some areas, I just quote my country, Italy, where you have a lot of geothermal energy, and a lot of companies sitting over there, but nobody does anything about it. So it would be with very low cost that you can tap.
Harness.
Yeah. or for example, also the sea energy, the wave movement. I mean, Italy is full of coast, so why don't you invest there? I mean, you should bring this renewable energy, use the renewable energy which is close to people and companies, and then of course it will cost less. Then of course there's the fact that if you want all this company to make the transition, and that's unavoidable, you also have to provide them with means to get there. So I think it's also the role of public authorities to develop also alternative and new financing method which allows SMEs to get on board and try to develop their plants and the products in a way that are less carbon intensive. So that's a public decision to give them the means to these small companies.
Access to finance.
Yes, exactly. This is, in my opinion, one of the key issues.
Jori, Ringman, very quickly, your thoughts when it comes to affordability of energy.
It was already mentioned that competitiveness and sustainability can go hand in hand, but I think it actually has to go hand in hand, because that's the only way of getting both sides working. And Nick painted the picture about the global competition very well in his previous remarks. So just adding on that, we are net exporter as a sector. So we generate really important export revenues for the European economy, which is vital to then have all the well-being in the continent here. But the tipping point of if we are exporting or net importing sector is all of them really, really close. And then that's where it's very important to keep that in mind. And then we are price takers like Nick as well mentioned for this sector on the global market. So we can't pass on this cost to the consumer or the customers. So we just have to be competitive and have to remain competitive. And that's where the affordability comes, of course, into the picture. But on the other hand, since we are, even with this high cost in Europe, still competitive enough to be net exporters, it means that we have some really key competitiveness factors in the sector inbuilt. So if we can find the solution, if there's an answer from the EU policy to the affordability of clean energy, then I think we can really explode with this competitiveness and really start generating something fantastic in Europe. And I like the idea of Nick saying that we need to not protect against carbon leakage, but reverse it. So start building this production in Europe with cleaner production than elsewhere. And then you need to then look at the system efficiency and not at the spot emissions or spot impacts or spot energy consumption. But that can be done, and I think it should be done. And the affordability of clean energy for all is then the key factor in that.
Thanks, Jori. Nick, Keramidas, your views when it comes to affordability of low carbon energy in sufficient volumes. What do you think should be the recipe there?
We need to go about it smartly, I think. First of all, we need to invest heavily on innovation. This has been mentioned already. Otherwise, with the tools that we have right now, with the way that we're going about it right now, it's going to be a massively expensive exercise that's not going to deliver. It's not going to deliver on climate change and on economic growth. So we need to innovate our way through this and invest heavily in innovation. We also need to be resource efficient. Resource efficiency, energy efficiency. This is not a mantra. This is not a tagline. Energy efficiency first is used commonly in Europe. Energy efficiency means affordable as well. Energy efficient is something that is by definition sustainable. So this is something that we need to build on in order to ensure affordability. Now, if it were affordable, the simple answer would be, it would have been done. We would do it without a second thought. We're a company that invests heavily into new processes, advanced technologies, and constantly building stuff. So we are on the move constantly. If the solution was readily there and it made all the economic sense in the world, quite frankly, we wouldn't be asking for support or guidance or whatever. We would just be doing it. And Dimitri and Alix alluded to the issue of CO2 revenues earlier. There's not enough money to go around to both finance all investment required for greening and offset all the costs of the transition. Let's be frank. This is why, exactly because there's not enough money to go around with the CO2 revenues. By the way, this revenue base is going to keep eroding as we move forward. It's not going to increase. It's going to decrease. So there's not enough money to go around, and for this reason particularly, we have to spend it smartly. There's a combination to be balance to be struck, and it's, well, navigating through the right technologies, readily available, a combination of readily available energy efficient technologies and innovation to take us where we want to go.
Thanks, Nick. To wrap up now, I'll ask each one of you very quickly in 2 sentences to say if you had 2 or 3 recommendations to make to policymakers as they examine the 55 package, what would it be? And then starting with you.
So the package is super broad. It's a difficult question, but I would say, again, this technology choice, really go for the right technology where it's needed, and for individual heating and cooling, this is mostly electrification and renewable based district heating. And energy efficiency first, tagline indeed, but looking at the practical, not only the money issue, but the practical hurdles and how to solve them, accompanying people in their innovation projects, etc. And this can be done through EDP.
Okay, thank you. Alix,
Thank you. Something I haven't mentioned, which I think is important, should be, it's not strictly part of the Fit for 55, but with the upcoming revision of the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, I hope it's going to be part of that, because it's linked to affordability, is having a neighborhood approach to renovation. Because I think this is also an opportunity to have efficiency gains. If you're renovating at district level, you can look at, district by district, what's the most appropriate solution, and at the same time tackle mobility aspect, storage aspect, urban design aspect. So this is something that we think is key to affordability, to building social participation and support. As I mentioned, we'd like to see this heat planning requirement being mirrored in the Renewable Energy Directive, with the associated capacity building word written all over the package, hopefully for local authorities. And as I said, this change of governance in the proposed social climate fund, if it goes through, I think even if ETS2 doesn't go through, we will need to have something to mitigate social impacts, because they're already there. So changing the governance model of how EU funds are being disbursed would be essential as well.
Thanks, Frédéric. Guido, Lena, your 2-3 recommendations to policy.
Yeah. First of all, I would ask, that's very challenging, but that the whole initiative of the package are brought forward simultaneously, because this would give the guarantee that in the end, the sort of consistency that the Commission gave in the beginning is kept in the end, because otherwise, if you start going in different directions with different timing, nobody will be able to understand what happens in the end. Secondly, that when the whole package is approved, it would be great to have an SME impact assessment on the whole package to see what really comes out, what has been decided, whether it's really applicable for most of the economy. And then thirdly, I would like to see the application of some new better regulation principles directly in this package already now. The Commission has just approved this idea of one in, one out. So if you start with new piece of bureaucracy, you should remove one out. So I would like this to be applied already during the legislative process in the Fit for 55 and see what comes out of it.
Okay, thank you. Jori, Ringman, your 2-3 recommendations?
Well, 3 recommendations. First, we have this endless cycle of revision of energy and climate change legislation in Europe that has to stop. So predictability and stability as of now is the key. That's the first one. The second is that really applies system thinking. I think there's so much risk of collateral damage in this rush of the future policy packages to the industry, to the opportunities in sustainability, to the local communities. So we have to have system thinking more applied there. And the third one is, I'm repeating myself, the affordable energy needs to be solved in this. And if we don't have a solution for that, there's very much hope that we can advance fast.
Thanks, Jori. And Dimitri, that's your 1-2-3 recommendations.
Regulatory certainty was raised already. Thank you very much, Jori, for that. And we want to invite the Commission to adopt the same evidence-based and science-based approach that they're focusing on as far as climate is concerned, on security of supply and affordability, as far as the transition is concerned, as far as the end game is concerned, for each sector, dedicated approach and impact assessment that will enable growth and development. For this to work, as I said earlier, we're going to have to innovate our way through it. It's not a solved exercise right now. So please make sure that you add into the picture this element of affordability, not just, and I don't mean it in any offensive way, not just for households, because currently there's a lot of debate in Europe around households, and that rightly so, basically, but you also need to focus on other sectors as well, on sectors supporting, very, very actively European exports, for instance, and so on and so forth. We need to follow that. Thanks.
Thanks, Nick Keramidas. Thanks, everyone. We've reached the end of this panel discussion. We'll now take a short 15-minute break before moving to the next panel discussion, focusing on the role of green molecules in decarbonisation. So stay tuned. We'll be back shortly.